Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Anglo-Scottish border ballad, The Daemon-Lover. Now, there's a lot of different versions of this, and so this is a slightly striking one. So the version that I'm reading comes out of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, but because it is a folk ballad, we don't actually know when it was composed, right? So that's one of the elements of folk songs, folk stories, folk culture in general, is we know that this was written down or this was published at least in 1812 in Scott's Minstrelsy, but that's not when it originated. So what it says here in the footnote is this is a ballad contributed by Scott's friend William Laidlaw, who took it down from the recitation of one Walter Grieve and also improved it with 4 stanzas of his own authoring. So, this is an interesting element of folk culture, and we're right in the sort of Romantic era, broadly defined. Late 1700s or into the early 1800s, there was a massive fascination with folk culture, particularly in the countries where Romanticism was most pronounced, places like the United Kingdom and Germany. So the Brothers Grimm, for instance, are in this tradition, but also a lot of Romantics became very interested in Scottish ballads, especially, or Scottish folk songs, things like this. To a lesser extent, Irish, and I would say still to a lesser extent, Welsh. There's also interest in English folk songs, etc., etc. And so the recording of this in 1812, the writing down of this poem is part of that trend. So the other thing that I guess is worth sort of immediately stating about this is that this is part of a large tradition of ballads. And ballads, of course, in the folk tradition are songs or poems that tell a story. So they have characters, they have conflict, they have plot, etc., etc. And this is a very common overarching theme. The bad lover, usually a bad male lover, and the poem or song is told from the perspective of or with a focus on the woman who is led astray, but that's not always the case, right? So some of these are just guys who are right bastards, right? So songs like Pretty Polly or Tom Dooley, things like this, for instance, in which a man just murders his lover for reasons that are never identified, right? But then the Daemon-Lover falls into the other broad category of this, which is supernatural entities leading people astray. And this one seems, I would say, much more mixed in terms of the gender balance, although some of that may be a more modern balancing. But for instance, Keats's Les Belles Dames sans Merci is a Daemon-Lover poem. Arguably Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, although that's slightly less clear, but this was a big genre of thing during this period, because you also have the first wave of Gothic literature in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so again, a folk ballad about a demon lover that has these sort of Gothic elements to it, that's going to be a fucking mega hit in 1812. People are going to eat that shit up. And indeed, it is a great poem. So let's talk about it, right? So what do we have actually going on in the poem? Because it does have a plot, so we can do a plot summary. Basically, this dude returns from 7 years spent in Ireland. Not clear why he was there, but so he returns to Scotland, lowland Scotland, northern England, whatever it is. We'll call it lowland Scotland because many of the border ballads, there seems to be a consensus that they originate on the north side of the border. So he returns to Scotland after 7 years in Ireland. He returns to his lover, but she is now married to someone else. And he says in the opening stanza, "Oh, where have you been, my long, long love, this long 7 years and mair? Oh, I've come to seek my former vows you granted me before." Or you granted me be fair, if we wanted to keep the rhyme scheme. So basically he shows back up and he's like, "Hey, we were lovers. You were like, I'm gonna marry you." And this is also another sort of traditional ballad element, right? Is where the lover goes away. In this case, typically male lover goes away out into the world to sail the oceans, to make their fortune, whatever it is. They return and they find that the woman that they were betrothed to is married to someone else. Very standard. We see it all the time in ballads. So this guy shows back up in Scotland or wherever it is, and he's like, "Hey, let's get married. Now I'm rich." And she's like, oh, awkward, because I married someone else and I've got kids now. So she says, "Oh, hold your tongue of your former vows, for they will breed sad strife. Oh, hold your tongue of your former vows, for I am become a wife." He does not hold his tongue of his former vows. He's basically like, well, yeah, I mean, you're married and you've got kids, but look how many nice ships I've got. I've got some sailors who will play lovely music while they're sailing, apparently. And so he convinces her to go with him, right? So she, as it says here, she has taken up her 2 little babes, kissed 'em baith cheek and chin. Oh, fare ye well, my ain 2 babes, for I'll never see you again. Right? So she is persuaded by his, I think it's 24 ships. Oh, 7 ships. So, sorry. 24 mariners. So he's got 8 ships, 7 that are on the sea, 1 that brought him to shore. He's got 24 mariners. They're going to play her some good music. It's going to be a fucking amazing ass time, right? That is what sells her. And presumably also there's some element of this was the guy that she was engaged to before. So probably there's just some genuine like, oh, yes, I love you or approximate loving you, whatever it is. And that is also weighing into my decision. But that is not necessarily made explicit in the poem, right? Like her internal life doesn't really enter into this portion of it. But long story short, she decides to go with him. They go and they get on the boat and she's like, this is slightly odd. I don't see any mariners, but this is a pretty fancy boat. So it says here, she set her foot upon the ship, no mariners could she behold, but the sails were of the taffeta, and the masts of the beaten gold. So it's a fancy ship, right? That's a nice ship. That's good stuff, taffeta and gold, right? I don't know if it's actually good ship construction materials. It probably isn't, but it's going to look really impressive. But there's no mariners, so that's unusual for a functioning ship, right? Usually, ships have mariners. They have sailors. They have people who are like pulling ropes and swabbing the poop deck and, making the ship actually function. That is not the case here. Ship takes off. It's sailing off. Still no mariners visible. And his expression changes. He becomes more grim. He becomes more sort of ominous in his facial expression. And then it says here, they had not sailed a league, but barely 3, until she espied his cloven foot, and she wept right bitterly. So the cloven foot is, of course, a traditional symbol of the devil or of a demon, right? The idea, and partially, I think this sort of goes back to the satyrs of ancient Greek culture, which then get turned into demons when Christianity emerges and becomes the dominant religious force in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? And the old gods in these various cultures get demonized. And because Greek culture was so central and so influential to Roman culture and to Roman Christianity or Roman Catholic Christianity, the iconography of the satyr, this Greek pastoral deity or sort of pastoral creature gets transported throughout Christian iconography, regardless of cultural context. So the cloven hoof, we've now pretty much got confirmation that this is some kind of demon or the devil or whatever it is, and it has led her astray. And she sees from the one side of the boat, she says here, "Oh, what are Oh, what hills are yon pleasant hills that the sun shines sweetly on?" And he says, "Oh, yon are the hills of heaven," he said, "where you will never win." And then she says, "Oh, what in a mountain is yon?" she said, "also dreary with frost and snow." "Oh, yon is the mountain of hell," he cried, "where you and I will go." So, what a bad day for her, because she has left her husband, left her children, to go with this guy who she thinks is her former lover, former fiance, whatever it is. He has promised her these great ships with these mariners singing these jaunty tunes, whatever it is. And now she finds out she has gone with a demon. The boat is no longer fancy. The taffeta and gold are gone. And he has got a cloven foot. His face has grown very grim and ominous, and he starts getting gigantic. He starts increasing in size until he literally just smashes this boat, and she sinks into the sea, and she drowns, and presumably her soul goes to the frosty mountain of hell, which apparently is what hell is a frosty mountain. So yeah, that's the plot of this poem, right? So again, this genre of poetry, the Daemon-Lover poem, is a very standard one. And I think that, so on the one hand, it certainly reflects a superstitious worldview rooted in a form of Christianity that takes very seriously the existence of witches, of demons, of evil spirits, etc., etc., right? This 1812-ish is sort of the tail end of the period where witch hunts and demon hunting was sort of most prevalent. That really is the 1600s and the 1700s, early 1700s, that's primarily the thing, right? So the great sort of demon hunting manuals and things like this, and the great anti-witch treatises. Malefice Maleficorum, I think is the name of it. I can't remember. That's written in these centuries. King James VI of Scotland / First of England's Daemonology is written in those preceding centuries, etc., etc. And so, again, we don't know when this poem was originally composed. The fact that the lover has come back from Ireland may be significant, but it's hard to pin that down, right? If this is as early as the late 16th century, this could be a reference to the 9 Years' War, which takes place starting in the 1590s. But it doesn't have to be that, right? This could be about the Ulster plantations. This could be about any number of rebellions that happened in Ireland that were put down by military force by the British during the 1700s. So we just, what we don't have here is enough details about when this is composed. And that's standard for folk ballads, right? You wouldn't expect that. But what we do have is, so again, I got slightly sidetracked there, but the point that I wanted to make is, on the one hand, we have a culture that is very much invested in the idea of the supernatural and evil supernatural, right? Which is demons, malicious spirits, etc. On the other hand, we have a culture rooted in patriarchal violence. And if we look closely at the text of the Daemon-Lover, we see that this really aligns quite closely with typical abusive behaviors, right? So one of the first things that happens, so this guy shows back up from Ireland. The woman's like, sorry, I'm married, can't go with you. And what it says here in the third stanza, he turned him right and round about, and the tear blinded his eye. I would never have trodden on Irish ground if it had not been for thee. Fourth stanza, I might have had a king's daughter far, far beyond the sea. I might have had a king's daughter had it not been for love of thee. So what's striking about that is emotional manipulation is a standard component of domestic abuse, right? The perhaps the most sort of stereotypical recognizable line is, see what you made me do, which is a way of transferring the responsibility for one's own actions onto the other person, right? I didn't want to hit you. I had to hit you because of what you did. It is your fault that I have hit you, right? And so we see that same kind of logic here, right? I would never have gone to Ireland if it hadn't been for you. You are the one who made me go. And so it is your fault that my actions in going to Ireland ruined our chances for a happy life together. It is putting blame onto the other person. Alongside this, we have sort of the denigrating of the other person in the relationship. I could have married a king's daughter if not for you, if I weren't dedicated to you. So that sort of that inversion of the abusive relationship, right? I could have had these great things. I could have been happy if I weren't stuck with you. It's your fault that I am suffering in this way. But I did it selflessly for you. I have accepted suffering because I'm dedicated to you. And so you should do what I want. You should comply with me, right? You should accept my abusive behavior because I have given up this great thing for you, right? So we've got that element of it. He then takes her out onto the ocean, right? So he separates her first from her family and takes her out onto the ocean. And I think these two things are intertwined, right? So she has taken up her two little babes and kissed them baith cheek and chin. Oh, fare you well, my ain two babes, for I'll never see you again. She set her foot upon the ship, right? one of the things that abusers consistently do is attempt to isolate their victims, right? So they will attempt to separate them from family, separate them from friends, separate them from community resources, whether that's like faith communities, whether that's friend groups, whether that's a book club, whatever it is. Because if you isolate the person that you are abusing, it's much harder for them to seek help or to have someone confirm that what they are experiencing is abuse and that they should seek alternatives. So they should seek escape from that situation, right? So in this case, the Daemon-Lover has separated her from her family, so separated her from a support system that could theoretically provide her an alternative to this negative relationship. And he has physically isolated her by putting her on a ship and taking her out to sea. A ship with no mariners, right? So there's no one even on the ship who could potentially assist her in any way. Of course, whoever would be on that ship probably would be demons anyway. So, probably there weren't going to be a ton of help anyway, but they're not there, right? There's just the two of them. They are entirely isolated and she is entirely in his power, which again is exactly what abusers tend to construct. And then this bit, she had not sailed a league, but barely 3. And that gets repeated later. When dismal grew his countenance and drumly grew his drumly means troubled. And then, not the next stanza, but the stanza after that, says, they had not sailed a league, but barely 3, until she espied his cloven hoof, and she wept right bitterly. This is another tactic that's commonly used by abusers. And there actually was, I recently saw a study about this, and it was in the context of this narrative that we have in the patriarchal, sexist, misogynist United States, at least, that women should have known that he was a bad guy. You as a woman should have known that he was abusive and you shouldn't have gotten into a relationship with him. Well, this study found that abusive men will mask their abusive tendencies for the first 6 months or so of a relationship until they've established a hook with that person, right? So abusers will hide the fact that they are abusive. They are aware that that is something that will drive the other person away. And so they manipulate that person by obscuring their true behavior until they have established enough control over that person that it is then harder for that person to leave the relationship. Here we're seeing exactly the same thing, right? So it's not as soon as they stepped onto the ship, he was like, ha, I'm demons ready to go to hell. It is, they have sailed out into the ocean. They've sailed a few leagues out into the ocean. It is way too far for her to swim back, assuming she can swim at all. And many people in the 1700s, early 1800s, could not swim. It was not a thing that people typically did. Clothes were very heavy at that point, and when they got bogged down with water, they became extraordinarily heavy. And so if she jumps into the ocean to attempt to escape, then she is likely to drown, right? So she has been tricked by this guy who she thought was her former fiance, whatever it was, and she has now been isolated by him. And it is only at that point that he reveals his true nature and his ill intent for her. And then, of course, at the end, he's become gigantic, which in itself is sort of almost metaphoric for the nature of an abusive relationship, right? Because the violence of that person, the violence of that abuser will tend to sort of loom over the victim and become dominant component of their entire life experience. But then at the end here, it says, he struck the topmast with his hand, the foremast with his knee, and he brake that gallant ship in twain, and sank her in the sea. It's an unfortunate fact that in the United States, at least, the person most likely to murder a woman is a domestic partner. That's statistically the truth of it. Women are most likely to experience homicide from a person that they are living with, whether particularly a male person that they are living with, whether that's a boyfriend, fiance, or husband. Abusers very, very often kill their victims. Yeah, there's very little else that I can say about that. I mean, it is just the truth of it. And we do, in the U.S. at least, unfortunately, live in a social context in which abuse is very often excused or downplayed or ignored, because we have a patriarchal society that glorifies violence, glorifies this idea of toughing it out, whatever it is, and that has a kind of Disney-fied conception of what love is, what romance is, in which we tend to say, well, give the relationship one more chance. True love is always worth fighting for. And unfortunately, that kills a lot of people, especially women.